The USS Monarch sailed across the dark expanse of the Pacific, its massive silhouette a fortress of steel and order amidst the endless waves. Among the 400 sailors on board were two men whose paths would cross in a way that would forever change their lives. Nathaniel Nate Brooks, 26, was tall and muscular, his jet black hair cut close to his scalp, emphasizing his sharp jawline and striking green eyes. Nate was a man of few words, known for his discipline and unshakable strength, both physical and emotional. In stark contrast stood William Will Carter, 22, a fresh-faced recruit with golden blonde curls that framed his youthful, angelic features. His athletic frame carried an energy that seemed almost restless, while his piercing blue eyes betrayed a curiosity and vulnerability that set him apart. Where Nate exuded stoic confidence, Will radiated an eager, almost reckless charm. Their first meaningful encounter was brief, but electric. Nate, assigned to oversee maintenance, spotted Will struggling to carry a heavy toolbox during a late-night shift. Without a word, Nate stepped in, his hands brushing against Will's as he lifted the equipment with ease. "Thanks," Will murmured, his voice soft but sincere. "Be more careful next time," Nate replied, his tone neutral yet lacking the harshness that typically colored his orders. As Nate walked away, Will remained rooted to the spot, watching him. He couldn't explain it, but something about the man stirred a feeling within him, a spark that unsettled and intrigued him all at once. For Nate, the moment lingered as well. Though he had spent years perfecting the art of suppressing emotion, something in Will's unguarded demeanor rattled the careful armor he had built. That night, neither man could sleep. Each lay awake, staring at the cramped ceilings of their cabins, wondering why a single moment had shaken them so deeply. As the days passed, Nate and Will's paths began to cross more often. Though their interactions remained professional, an unspoken tension simmered between them, growing with each exchange. Will, ever curious, found himself looking for reasons to speak with Nate. Whether it was a casual remark or a question about their tasks, he sought out the man who seemed to fill every room with quiet authority. "How long have you been in the Navy?" Will asked one afternoon as they worked side by side on a maintenance project. "5 years," Nate replied without looking up. "Do you ever get used to it? Being out here, I mean?" Will pressed, glancing at Nate's stoic profile. Nate hesitated, his expression unreadable. "You don't get used to it," he finally said. "You endure it." Will frowned, the weight of the answer settling over him. "That sounds lonely," he said softly. "It's the job," Nate replied curtly, but his eyes flicked toward Will, betraying a flicker of something unspoken. As the weeks turned into months, their conversations grew deeper, slipping into a realm of intimacy neither had expected. Nate spoke of his childhood, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. Will, in turn, opened up about his dreams of adventure and his constant struggle to find a place where he truly belonged. One evening, as they sat together on the upper deck beneath a blanket of stars, Nate allowed himself to smile. A small, fleeting gesture, but one that made Will's heart race. It was a crack in the armor Nate had spent years perfecting. And for Will, it was a glimpse of something rare and precious. It was a quiet night on the USS Monarch. The sky above was an endless sea of stars, their light reflected in the still waters below. Will leaned against the railing, the cool breeze tousling his golden hair. Nate approached silently, his footsteps muffled against the metal deck, He stopped beside Will, his presence as steady and grounding as the ship beneath them. "It's beautiful out here," Will said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Nate replied, though his eyes were fixed on Will rather than the horizon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves and the faint hum of the ship's engines. Then, without thinking, their shoulders brushed, a small, innocent touch that sent a jolt through both of them. Will turned to face Nate, his blue eyes searching. "Do you ever wonder, what it'd be like if things were different?" he asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the question. Nate's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Will meant, but the thought was suffocating. "It doesn't matter," he said gruffly. "But it does," Will insisted, his voice gaining strength. "It matters to me." Before Nate could respond, a shout from below deck shattered the moment, forcing them apart. Yet as they returned to their duties, the memory of that touch lingered. A promise unspoken, a boundary irreversibly crossed. Desperate for privacy, Nate and Will began meeting in the ship's storage room, a cramped, dimly lit space that smelled of oil and salt. There, hidden from prying eyes, they built a world of their own, far removed from the rigid structure of the Navy. They talked for hours, sharing secrets and fears they had never dared voice aloud. Nate revealed a softer side of himself, one that even he had forgotten existed. Will spoke of his longing for freedom, his voice tinged with hope and defiance. One night, as they sat together on the cold metal floor, Will reached for Nate's hand. "I don't care what the world thinks," he said, his voice steady despite the tears glistening in his eyes. "I just want to be with you." Nate tightened his grip on Will's hand. "Me too," he murmured. "But the world doesn't let men like us be happy." "We'll find a way," Will said, his determination unwavering. "We have to." Their kisses were hesitant at first, born of fear and longing. But as the nights passed, their connection deepened, each touch a declaration of the love they could not openly express. For a time, the storage room became their sanctuary, a place where their love could exist without fear. The night wrapped the USS Monarch in a thick, oppressive stillness. While most of the crew rested in their bunks, Rick Stanton was wide awake, his mind whirring with vindictive energy. He had watched Nate and Will for weeks, piecing together the puzzle with every stolen glance and late-night absence. Tonight, he was sure he'd catch them in the act, and with that certainty came a venomous satisfaction. Rick wasn't alone. He had rallied a handful of sailors who shared his disdain for anything that didn't fit their narrow view of honor and manhood. They moved silently through the ship's metal halls, their boots muffled as they approached the storage room. Rick signaled for them to stop just outside the door. Pressing an ear against the cold steel, he smirked. Faint voices drifted through the crack, soft, intimate, unmistakable. Inside, Nate and Will were oblivious to the danger. They sat close together on a stack of crates, their knees almost touching. The dim light cast shadows across their faces, but their expressions were open and vulnerable in a way they could only afford in this hidden space. "I can't stop thinking about how Rick's been looking at us," Nate said, his voice low and tense. His eyes, normally so steady, flicked anxiously toward the door as if sensing the threat outside. Will leaned forward, his hand brushing against Nate's. "He's just trying to scare us," he said, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his tone. "He can't prove anything." "That doesn't mean he won't try," Nate replied, his voice hardening. He reached up to rub his temples, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of his fears. Will, if he finds out for sure, if he tells the others, it won't just be threats anymore. It'll be worse. Will's heart clenched at Nate's words, but he refused to give in to the fear. You think I care what Rick or anyone else thinks? They don't matter. What we have does. For a moment, Nate's expression softened. He reached out, taking Will's hand in his own. You mean everything to me, he murmured, his voice barely audible. That's why I'm scared. I can't lose you. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment they forgot the dangers outside. They forgot the ship, the whispers, the world that would never accept them. All that existed was the warmth of each other's presence. But the illusion shattered with a sudden deafening crash. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. Rick stood in the doorway, his grin wide and venomous. Behind him, 4 sailors loomed, their faces twisted with disgust and malice. Well, isn't this cozy? Rick sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Looks like we found the lovebirds. The room seemed to shrink as Rick and his men advanced, their presence oppressive and menacing. Nate rose instinctively, positioning himself between Will and the intruders. His fists clenched at his sides, his muscles coiled like springs. Get out, Nate said, his voice calm but laced with steel. This has nothing to do with you. Rick laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Will's spine. Nothing to do with us. You think we're just gonna let this slide? 2 men disgracing the uniform, making a mockery of the Navy? No, Brooks. This has everything to do with us. Before Nate could respond, 2 of Rick's men lunged forward. They grabbed his arms, slamming him back against the wall. Nate struggled, his strength formidable, but the sailors held him fast. Will tried to rush to his aid, but Rick intercepted him, shoving him roughly to the ground. Stay down, Carter, Rick growled, looming over him. You're in enough trouble as it is. Will looked up at Rick, his blue eyes blazing with defiance despite the fear twisting in his gut. You don't scare me, he spat. Rick crouched down, his face inches from Will's. Oh, you should be scared, he said, his voice low and venomous. Because you're about to find out what happens to freaks like you out here. Nate's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. Rick, leave him alone. This is between you and me. But Rick wasn't listening. He stood, motioning for his men to grab Will. Bring him, he ordered, his tone cold and final. As Will was dragged from the room, he turned back toward Nate, his eyes wide with panic. Nate, he shouted, his voice breaking. Nate fought against his captors, his fury unrestrained. Rick, stop this! Don't you touch him! But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The last thing he saw was Will being hauled out of the room, his struggling form swallowed by the darkness of the corridor. The deck was eerily quiet as Rick and his men dragged Will into the open night. The stars above glittered coldly, indifferent to the cruelty unfolding below. The wind whipped at Will's face, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped him as he realized where they were taking him. They stopped at the edge of the ship, the ocean below a yawning void of blackness. Rick pushed Will forward, holding him dangerously close to the railing. You think you can disgrace this ship and get away with it? Rick hissed. You don't deserve to be here. Hell, you don't deserve to be anywhere. Will twisted in Rick's grip, his body aching from the rough handling. But his spirit remained unbroken. He lifted his head, meeting Rick's gaze with defiance. You can hate me all you want, he said, his voice steady despite the tears brimming in his eyes. But you'll never erase what I had with him. Never. Rick's expression darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. We'll see about that. Without another word, he shoved Will backward. Time seemed to slow as Will fell, his golden hair catching the faint light of the stars. The sound of his body hitting the water echoed through the night, followed by the silence of the waves. Rick turned away, his face unreadable. It's done, he said, his voice flat. Let's go. When Nate was finally released from the grip of Rick's men, he stumbled through the dim corridors of the USS Monarch, his body battered and his mind spinning with a singular thought. Finding Will. His breathing was labored, his ribs aching with each step. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror clutching his heart. Will, he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. The name echoed through the empty hallways, but no answer came. His footsteps grew frantic as he searched every corner of the ship, his voice cracking with each cry. Will, where are you? By the time he reached the infirmary, his body was trembling, both from exhaustion and dread. He burst through the door, startling the lone medic on duty. Where's Carter? He demanded, his voice thick with panic. The medic hesitated, his eyes darting away from Nate's piercing gaze. I'm sorry, he stammered. Carter fell overboard during his shift. It was an accident. Nate froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. His knees buckled and he gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. That's not true. I'm sorry, the medic repeated, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. There's nothing we could do. Nate's mind raced. He knew the truth, even if no one would admit it. Will hadn't fallen. He'd been taken, ripped from him by the hatred of men who saw their love as a threat. The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but even in his despair, a flicker of rage burned in his chest. As the days passed, the official story spread among the crew. Will Carter, the promising young sailor, had tragically fallen to his death during routine duties. No one questioned it, and no one mentioned the whispers or the events leading up to that night. The silence of the crew was as damning as the act itself. Nate was discharged soon after, his injuries cited as the reason. He didn't fight it. There was nothing left for him aboard the Monarch. The Navy had taken everything from him, the man he loved, the sense of purpose that had once defined him, even the will to fight. When he returned home, the world seemed dull and lifeless. The once familiar streets felt foreign, and the solitude of his small apartment only amplified the emptiness inside him. Nights were the worst. Alone in the darkness, he replayed every moment with Will. The stolen glances, the whispered confessions, the promises they'd made under the cover of stars. Each memory cut deeper than the last, a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Unable to find peace within the walls of his home, Nate began spending his nights by the ocean. The rhythmic crash of the waves was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of the vast, indifferent force that had swallowed Will whole. He would sit for hours staring at the horizon as if expecting Will to emerge from the water, his golden hair glinting in the moonlight. One night, he brought with him the crumpled piece of paper that Will had given him, a poem written in the younger man's careful hand. It had been a gift, shared during one of their first secret meetings. Nate unfolded it now, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. The ocean is vast, but our love is endless. Let the waves carry our hearts to a place where we can be free. Under the stars, we'll find our truth. And in the depths, we'll never be apart. The words blurred as tears filled Nate's eyes. He clutched the paper to his chest, his body shaking with silent sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. "I couldn't save you. I wasn't strong enough." As the tide crept closer, Nate thought of the life they could have had, a life stolen by hatred and fear. He thought of Will's laughter, the way his blue eyes sparkled when he spoke of his dreams, the warmth of his touch. Those memories were all he had left, and he clung to them desperately, refusing to let the world erase the man he had loved. In the weeks that followed, Nate tried to move forward, but the weight of Will's absence was unbearable. He avoided people, retreating further into himself. The world felt wrong without Will in it, as though the colors had faded, leaving only shades of gray. One evening, he returned to the shoreline where he had spent so many sleepless nights. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For a moment, the beauty of it caught him off guard, and he imagined Will sitting beside him, his golden hair glowing in the fading light. "I hope you're at peace," Nate murmured, his voice carried away by the wind. "I hope, wherever you are, you know how much you meant to me." The waves lapped at his feet, their steady rhythm a cruel reminder of the world's indifference. Yet, in that moment, Nate felt a strange sense of clarity. Will's life, though cut tragically short, had been meaningful. Their love, brief as it was, had been real, and that reality was something no one could ever take away. For the rest of his life, Nate carried Will with him. In every crashing wave, in every star-filled sky, he felt the echo of their love. It was a scar, raw, permanent, and painful. But it was also a reminder of the courage it took to love in a world that forbade it. Though Nate would never truly heal, he found solace in the memory of what they had shared. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause, he could almost hear Will's voice carried on the wind. "We'll find a way. We have to." This story isn't just a heartbreaking tale. It's a silent cry of love and courage in a world that often turns cruel toward those who dare to love differently. Knowing that this is a true story sent in by one of our followers makes every moment even more poignant. Imagine living with the constant fear of being discovered, yet finding the strength to love so deeply. Nate and Will were victims of a society that didn't allow them to be who they were, but the love they shared, though brief, was powerful enough to challenge the hatred around them. The tragedy of losing Will in such a brutal and unjust way is a harsh reminder of how prejudice can destroy lives. But it also makes us reflect on the bravery it takes to love even when the world forbids it. Nate survived, but he carried the scars of a love torn away from him for the rest of his life. The saddest part is knowing that stories like this still happen today in many parts of the world because there are still places where loving is an act of defiance. We want to hear from you in the comments. What rating would you give this video? Where are you watching from? And if you can, share with us a similar story that you think deserves to be turned into a video on this channel. It could be something you've experienced, something you've witnessed, or even a fictional idea inspired by this narrative. Your input means the world to us. And don't forget to follow this page for more impactful stories like this one. Together, we can continue to give voice to stories that need to be heard